right. So it is wonderful that so many people are still alive. Of course, not everybody has been at this for 6 days without, almost no break. But it is a few more highlights that we really have to that we have here for the end. Today is the day of which you had a climate session in every single slot, and we end also on a high note in terms of climate. Jean Pisani-Ferry has written a very influential report for the French government and is going to talk about economic and public finance consequences of decarbonization. And then Marcin Kacperczyk, is he here? There he is. Will talk about financial, what is the title? Oh, okay, the technology, yes, okay. Technological progress and CO and decarbonization. Okay, Jean, the floor is yours. 20 minutes, thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you, it's very good that I can present here some thoughts that are largely based on the report I did for the Prime Minister, which is actually available in English. You have the links here. And I'm going to draw also on other sources because not everything is in the report, obviously. The starting point is just to check, have a visual expression of the magnitude of the challenges ahead of us. So those are it's a composition of the world energy supply from 1800 to 2050, assuming we're getting to net zero in 2050. And so you see that you have the traditional biomass, and then you have coal, then you have oil, then you have gas, etc. And then you have the renewables. And what you see, very vividly in this graph is that the speed of transformation is without precedent. It's an industrial transformation at warp speed. It takes about 70 years for coal to, transition from being a marginal source of energy to becoming the dominant source of energy. It took about 50 years for oil and gas. And we're going to have to achieve the same in 25 years. So it's a really big challenge globally. The mechanisms behind this transformation are essentially three. There is a redirection of technical progress, there is sufficiency, and there is a substitution of capital for fossil fuels. So the redirection of technical progress is powerful, but it's a sort of long-term mechanism. Sufficiency is a concept that's hard to define precisely. I try to do it, but that's what you do when you travel less or when you eat less red meat. And so it's a change in the behavior that's driven by social norms or by public policy. And substitution of capital for fossil fuels is the main mechanism. And it's a mechanism that's behind the move from fossil fuels power plants to renewables. It's mechanisms that behind the fact that you're buying your electric vehicle at a higher price than the current fossil fuels powered ones, and also the mechanisms behind heat pumps and the renewable renovation of buildings. So that's a sort of genuine mechanism that has a generic character. Now, let me go quickly through all three. The redirection of technical progress is something that has been driven by the change in the direction of research, the change, the reallocation of research and development, and it's taking place and it's actually delivering. So it's really this sort of Philippe Aguillon's views of the world. You have the traditional sources of technical progress that are very much based on fossil fuels. You have all this accumulation of fossil fuel patents, so that makes fossil fuels-based energy less expensive, more competitive than the renewables. And then you've got to redirect technical progress towards renewables. So it is actually happening that the allocation of R&D investment from 2016 to 2022, so globally, so you see that the blue correspond of low carbon private research and development, the orange is low carbon public research and development, and what you're seeing is that the transformation is going really fast. And it is actually delivering. I think one of the very good news we have is that the IEA, in each report looks at the deployment of renewables and compares with previous estimates of their deployment. And here each dot represents that for wind, for solar, and for electric cars, each dot corresponds to a vintage. So the first one of the bottom corresponds to 2015, so the time of the Paris Agreement. The one at the top is 2023. And each time we've been surprised on the high side, which I think is very good news. Sorry? No, this is global. This is global. And so globally, for example, for wind, it was assumed that in electricity generation, wind would be by 2030, wind would be below 5%, and now the estimate is that wind will be 15%. So this is major. And finally, part of the critique of the IEA approach was that to say, okay, all that hinges on technologies that are not yet mature. So it's a bet on the future development of technology. But in fact, the report of 21 has been revised, and now the report of 23 assumes that only 1/3 of the technology development that are required by 2050 to get to net zero are not yet at a stage where you can confidently assume that they will be there on time. So that's demonstration of our prototype. So demonstration of prototype were roughly 50% of the total. Now the 1/3 of the total estimate of the availability of those technologies by 2050. So that's good news. Now sufficiency. Sufficiency is a difficult concept for economists because, the basic micro model assumes that consumers are utility maximizers, and that if you're sort of trying to change the behavior, you have to use an instrument, so you have to do it through prohibition, or you have to do it through a price. I mean, that preferences don't change endogenously. In fact, preferences do evolve. The graph represents the circulation of bikes in Paris over a period of 4 years. Circulation of bikes has more than doubled multiplied by 2.7 in 4 years. So that's an indication. Obviously, that's triggered in part by the creation of bike lanes, dedicated bike lanes, but it's also a change in the standard, in change in the way people see what it is to be a good citizen. It's increasing incredibly fast, this transformation, and so that's the indication that preferences do evolve, and they evolve. They're affected by information on co-benefits. They're influenced by social norms that shape public policy. So there is a whole interesting exercise to do, which is to sort of try to represent in a micro framework how you can take into account the transformation of those preferences. Sufficiency on the whole is not a major contributor. So the blue part is the substitution of capital for fossil fuels. So it's more than 3/4 of the total. But for some sectors, sufficiency is a significant contributor, like transports. So there can be actually, and it's not something you can neglect. Now, the main mechanism is going to be the capital fossil fuel substitutions. And this is a mechanism that, again, it has a generic character. And the graph, this graph is taken from the Climate Change Committee, the British Climate Change Committee report. And it shows very clearly that above the line you have all the investment, and below the line you have the savings on operating expenses. And what's clear is that you need to invest quite a lot. The 40 billion line corresponds roughly to 2% of GDP. So you've got to invest up to 2% of GDP and to keep this level of investment for quite some time in order to get the reduction in OPEX expenses. So it's really a sort of, invest first and then get the benefit later mechanism. So that's essentially the same applies to, the way the transition is conducted in various countries, including evidently in the French case. And there is a consensus on this number of about 2% of GDP of investment per year, maintained over perhaps 2 decades in order to achieve net zero. So in the French case, the additional investment is detailed here. So you have this combination of, you have a -8 for electric vehicles for households. This is because there's an assumption that there's a less of a use of individual vehicles. So some effect of sufficiency. So the calculation is a bit complex, but that's what it gives. So the bulk consists in investment in buildings, and I'm going to go back to that with a question at the end. But that's basically, the way it was done is that it's a very granular approach. You have to look at the number of boilers, of fuel boilers that exist, and you have to count how much investment it requires to replace them, and you have to look at the number of gas boilers, etc. So you do it bottom up by aggregating the investment, and you're getting those numbers, and the total number, that's not public, obviously, but that's the total investment representing more. Sorry? What? Because it's compared to baseline, where people do have more cars, and so you're replacing electric internal combustion engine cars with the electric cars, and so the net effect is negative. If you look at the investment that it represents for households, it's a high investment. So the finding here is that renovating your house, so heat pump plus renovation, building renovation, or change of heating system, and the purchase of electric vehicles, that's gross. Each time it's about 1 year of income for middle class households. So here, middle class households, it's about 1 year of income. So it's highly significant because you have to think that those people, they already have debt, they already bought their house, or they don't have necessarily access to credit. They're not very good clients for the banking system. Banking system works, more with people in the upper half of the income and wealth distribution than the bottom half. And so the question is, how can you ensure the affordability of this investment? And what we say in the report is that inevitably there is a fiscal cost involved, and this fiscal cost is significant. So you can do financial engineering, you can do all sorts of tricks to reduce the fiscal cost, but at the end of the day, it's going to be there. That's the breakdown between public and private cost. And it's highly sector dependent, obviously. So you're seeing for housing, for public building, it's 100% public. For private housing, there's still a part that is going to be covered in one way or another by public spending. Now, I would really wish to see the same kind of estimate for other countries, because this, to my knowledge, does not exist for other European countries, although we are all committed to reaching net zero, but looking in detail at the public finance implication hasn't been done elsewhere. So how to finance this investment? Again, public-private split is uncertain, but there is an incompressible fiscal cost, and you have to recognize it. The reshuffling of public, and then, we're coming up with a number that's about half of the total is going to be paid by the public budget, either because it's investment that's made by the public sector, typically, the renovation of schools, which are public in France, and so that has to be paid by the public sector. They can be, financial engineering to let investor contribute, and then you would pay the state or the local authority would pay in terms of interest costs. But it's evident that the basis for this kind of arrangement is not very strong, because in the end it's going to cost more than the present value of the cost is going to be larger if it's financed by private sector than if it's financed by the public sector. So this raises the question of debt. And so the question is, how much of this investment can be paid by public debt? And this very much connects with the ongoing discussion on the reform of the fiscal rules in Europe. But as a matter of principle, climate preservation is a good reason to go into debt if they are, if these are investments that are going to pay off in terms of revenue, future savings on revenues. And finally, the transition raises major fiscal revenue challenges. First, to find substitutes to brown resources, which exist in significant amounts in most countries. And second, because to pay for this transition, the question is whether you're going to be able to pay just by reshuffling spending, or by borrowing. There can be a reason to consider tax receipts. A word on the European dimension. Climate action, it's a strange type of arrangement. Climate is an EU policy. Energy is a national policy. That's treaty-based. The treaty is written that, environment is EU competence, so the EU is negotiating at the COP in Dubai, and the EU really speaking for everyone. But at the same time, the energy is a national prerogative, and especially the choice of an energy mix is a national prerogative. So that's the kind of environment in which the EU has to jangle, and it's done it, and it sort of has found ways to contribute to paying for the investment through all sorts of funds. The problem, I'm not going to go into detail, you have it on the slide. The problem is that these funds currently deliver about 50 billion per year. In 2 years, it's going to be down to less than 20. And because essentially the recovery and resilience facility, it's terminated. It's not. It was expected to run from 2020 to 26, and so in 26 it ends contributing significantly. So there's going to be a shortfall right at the time when national governments face the difficulty of investing in this transition. Remember that in the UK case, and it's very much the same in the European case, it's sort of the ramping up is gradual, but and the 2% threshold is reached at the end of the decade. So that's something that's going to create difficulties, especially if the fiscal rules prevent governments from borrowing for the climate. So, conclusions. The first is that the significant and underappreciated economic and fiscal consequences of climate action. There is no reason to postulate a sort of permanent trade-off between growth and preservation of climate. I'm saying that because there is a strong current that says there's nothing we can do for climate but to reduce growth. So degrowth is not the solution, but the investment cost is there. So there's no permanent trade-off, but there is a short-term trade-off with all this investment that goes into saving on fossil fuels, changing the energy system, changing the production system from a system that's intensive on fossil fuels to a system that relies much more on carbon-free sources. So that's a difficult transition. And this transition raises difficult equity issues. It's all the political economy experiences we have is that this equity issue can be a stumbling block. And finally, what's surprising for those of us who started, thinking about climate change in terms of the carbon tax, and the question was what to do with the revenues. Here, it's all in all likelihood the total contribution of the total fiscal effect of the transition will be negative. And what I'm saying here is that it can be negative to the tune of 20 billion per year, or minus 7.75% of GDP. Questions for the future? Let me be very quick and just mention them. Does the French estimate apply to other countries? There are, things that go in different directions. For example, French electricity system is already carbon-free, so you don't have to invest. But at the same time, the French public sector is large, so it would be interesting to see estimates for other countries. The question of whether blended finance can help, financial engineering can help, limiting the public investment. That's very much something on which the discussion is open. The sequencing of action, I think that's important because that's the abatement cost curve. That's for Belgium, actually. So it goes from 1 to 3.5. So it's evidently the effect of investment on carbon emission, CO2 emission are very different depending on the sector and within sectors actually. So the question is, what do you do with that? Do you start with what's the least costly, or do you start across the board without differentiating? I think that's an important strategic question. Finally, 2 points. Adaptation. Adaptation, we know very little about the cost of adaptation. And so really don't trust the numbers that are in the report. I mean, the numbers are just a measure of our ignorance on this, in this regard. And second, to all the questions that we discussed already in the previous panel on whether decarbonization globally will be hampered by the shortage of critical raw material. I don't think it will in the long run, but I mean in the short run, obviously when you increase the demand for critical raw materials by a factor 3 or 4, there are going to be shortages and it's going to be, bumpy. Let me stop here, having been too long.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation. The EBRD did household surveys in 34 countries, including Germany, and we asked people whether they believe climate change is real and will affect their children. And in more than 50% of countries, in every country pretty much, more than half of the people said yes. But when we ask people, should government prioritize environment over jobs, or are you willing to pay more taxes to fight climate change, the numbers dropped substantially. And it's not just Eastern Europe, it's actually in Germany as well. How are we going to ensure that the public continues to support green transition given the cost both to the public purse as well as the private cost? Thank you.
Good question. I don't have the answer. The only thing I would wish to say is that the experience in Germany with the heat pumps, in France with the yellow vests, in the UK with the zero emission zone of Greater London. I mean, the manifestation was different, but always it gave already clear indication that households don't want to pay for the transition. The their concerns. They're not in denial of climate change, but they want to be supported. And so that's why there is a public finance challenge.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and talk about this important topic. I think we all agree on that. So before that, I wanted to congratulate CEPR for this wonderful symposium and another year of fantastic involvement with researchers and policymakers around the world. I think you are doing a great job, and we all thank you for all your contributions. So this is actually an interesting topic. We didn't coordinate with Jean, but to some extent we may find a little bit of disagreement in certain parts of this conversation, or maybe a little bit of a parallelism in the way how I'm going to discuss this now. So this is based on a research project with Patrick Bolton, who is in the audience, and a student of ours from Imperial, Moritz Wiedemann. So essentially, I think the starting point for this is that we know that for us to kind of make a transition to a better world, there has to be a role of technology in the process of decarbonization. So we kind of learned through a lot of different experiments that we can't just do it by restricting output, by basically putting policies that kind of degrowth the economy. There are many reasons for that, and as such, technology and its progress is going to be vital. And I think what's useful, and this is coming from Jean's nice presentation now, is to recognize that some of this basically decarbonization that we need to endure is to some extent resting on the promise of the technology actually coming in the future. He made a nice point that this is actually getting better and better in a sense that a lot of existing technologies are already in place to do it, but there is clearly a gap in the way how we are going to actually make this transition. So what we thought about in this paper was essentially to ask the question, to what extent we can actually take this bet? To what extent what we don't see in terms of the current kind of installation of technologies holds promise in the question of decarbonization? And specifically, we wanted to take this kind of broad-based global experiment to try to understand whether innovation in the green and brown efficiency technologies actually can offer meaningful decarbonization of the private sector. So essentially, this question that technology and its innovation are actually important is something that is one of the central points during this debate of climate risk, and I think this is particularly expressed by a lot of people in the private sector. So here are a few quotes that we have gathered from people who kind of matter in the open spectrum of the discussion of the climate: Larry Fink, Bill Gates, and others to be named. They all kind of collectively hold this idea that essentially what we need is a lot of capital to support innovation. And essentially, if we can think about what's going to be the kind of main thing going forward for the world, this will be indeed this kind of process, the process in which the new companies are going to be involved in creating the new technologies that are going to essentially facilitate this green transition. And to kind of summarize it in one phrase, essentially what they are talking about is that green innovation is the silver bullet. And the simple kind of point that we want to make is this so? So this is what I want to show you today and discuss with you. I want to tell you to what extent can we take evidence from the data that we can gather to the best of our abilities and see that actually the green innovation, something that is kind of capitalized in the process of patents and innovation, is the process that can actually lead to decarbonization. And there are kind of good reasons to think that this can actually help and this may actually not help. So on the positive side, this is related to the point that Jean has made. There is kind of an existing literature, especially from the R&D and economics kind of camp, that essentially argues that when we innovate, that automatically translates into some kind of R&D deployment, and that technology leads to decarbonization. So essentially, the whole point of this kind of debate is not so much whether R&D actually and innovation actually leads to decarbonization, is more how we should actually facilitate it. So these papers by Philippe Aguillon and co-authors and many others kind of try to think of the optimal way to structure basically the system such that we could promote as much innovation as possible. And this is clearly something that economically is plausible. If we believe that this innovation actually is leading to the deployment of capital and it's actually productive, then maybe this is something that we should be supporting. Even though we will want to argue, and this is kind of a little bit of a big picture conclusion of my talk today, is that these arguments are oftentimes made in a kind of unconditional way. So their statements are we should support all the innovation in the green space, and these are not necessarily discriminatory policies. But at the same time, when you think about this a little bit more, you start recognizing that the process can be actually not as simple as it may sound. That this idea of supporting green innovation may have potential unintended consequences, or at least some kind of counter forces that we need to think about in the way how we think about the process of decarbonization. And there are a few kind of channels that we want to highlight here. So the first channel is the old channel, is the channel voiced by Jevons in the 19th century in the context of the coal industry, where he essentially argued that if we want to kind of improve the extraction of coal, this is going to be great, we are going to make things efficient, but there is a basically rebound effect, or essentially what he called a paradox, that as we use the technology that is becoming more and more efficient, the demand for the technology is going to increase, and as such the aggregate quantity actually of the negative good could actually be higher rather than lower. So in some sense you may argue that even if technology is actually efficiency improving, by consuming more of the technology in the aggregate space, we may actually contribute more rather than less to the problem, which is the carbon emissions. And this is the kind of standard way to think about products like iPhone or others, that people get excited about how efficient they are, but at the same time they are actually boosting this demand for this product to a big extent. And then there are other stories that you can also come up with. Some of them are due to arrows. So this idea that is kind of reminiscent a little bit of the work of Aguillon et al., that essentially there is a path dependency. And the cost of basically switching the technology into something else may be too high, and as such companies are going to continue doing what's actually best for them. So this idea of learning by doing is the strong force may actually maintain the status quo in the way that we are not going to make the transition to the new technology. And then in the context of climate, what also becomes interesting is this notion of production network and how we actually account for the emissions in the global kind of economic system. So of course the direct emissions that are produced at source are very important, but importantly we also need to recognize that companies can actually kind of lead to a production of emissions elsewhere. And this is the story of indirect emissions, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions we are all very familiar with. But just to give you some examples, oftentimes we talk about Tesla as this great kind of discovery of the green transition, where we say that the car has basically led to the removal of emissions from the driving of it. But of course we all need to recognize that Tesla is not carbon free, in a sense that it already creates a lot of emissions both in terms of scope 2 and scope 3. Unless we green out the energy that powers Tesla, or we are going to produce Tesla in a green kind of carbon-free model, Tesla is actually a car that contributes to carbon footprint. There is some interesting anecdotal discussion that argues that you would need to drive at least 50,000 miles of Tesla to kind of beat the standard combustible engine car in terms of their contribution to emissions. And this is not the case to tell you we should all ignore Tesla and Tesla is irrelevant. All I want to say is that you need to be a little bit more nuanced in the way how you think of this carbon accounting and the contribution of the technology to this process of decarbonization. And of course, there could be a kind of general equilibrium adjustment by which the kind of introduction of one technology may kind of displace another technology. That's kind of the case of thinking of hybrid cars vis-a-vis the standard kind of diesel cars. So of course the aggregate effects are again a little bit unknown, to what extent one kind of replaces the other one in the way how we actually produce emissions globally. So this is kind of all that requires some kind of serious empirical study, and this is exactly what we embarked on. We wanted to take these ideas on place and try to think as carefully as possible about how much evidence we have on this particular question, and can we put some kind of data to understand a little bit the mechanisms that I have outlined. So what we have looked at in this study is the evidence from the global companies, publicly listed companies largely, mostly because of the data that we have available, but the data that actually comes from a big kind of global experiment, more than 80 countries, and we recognize the importance of this because in the end, the emissions is the aggregate problem. It's not a problem of one company, it's not a problem of one country, it's a problem of everything that drives basically the climate change. So the period we are looking at is pretty representative of a lot of forces that we would like to get informed about. 2005 to 2020, we have extended this until 2022, and the conclusions are actually pretty much similar. So there are three questions essentially that I want to kind of discuss today. The first question is very simple, which is, to what extent can we link innovation to some kind of meaningful decarbonization at the firm level? Do we observe that companies that innovate more in the green space subsequently decarbonize more of their activity? So this is just the very direct kind of evidence that we are looking for. And then of course the question is, what's the mechanism by which you can actually think about it? And there are these three aspects that I have already mentioned, the Jevons paradox, the learning by doing, and the arrow replacement effect. And finally, you can also think about this notion of externalities from the kind of technological perspective. To what extent innovation in one company may be actually destined into other companies. As such, you want to look a little bit of this story of displacement of technology and the kind of public good that one company can create for everyone else using that specific technology. So in terms of the data, we are going to follow a pretty standard protocol. So the data is going to be from Orbis vendor. So Orbis is pretty well known in the data for innovation in general. So we are going to collect the information on innovation of both publicly and privately owned companies. And we are going to also use Orbis to collect data on firm fundamentals. So we will want to understand how does the typical company looks like in the way how it may actually have a potential to decarbonize. So contrary to some studies that solely focus on the US Patent Office, we are going to try to measure innovation from many different kind of sources, and specifically listing out the US, Japanese, and the European Patent Office as the three kind of main sources of listing of innovation. And we are going to match this data with the data on carbon emissions. This is the data that Patrick and I have used in the past, that many people these days are also using from S&P Global. And that's where the limitation comes, in the sense that our data on emissions is largely about publicly listed companies. So in this regard, we are going to be looking at emissions in the public sector. So now, in terms of innovation and how to classify it, we are going to kind of come up with a very straightforward definitions, largely building on the existing methodologies. So the green innovation is going to be the technology that substitutes carbon dioxide with something that does not rely on the carbon dioxide. And then we are going to also distinguish something we are going to call the brown efficiency technology, which is essentially the improvement of the usage of basically fossil fuel. So you may argue that if I put a carburetor in the car, I'm still going to emit, but I'm going to emit with a much better efficiency of this CO2 production. So just to kind of, in the interest of time, the classification we have is going to some extent, mimic what people have thought about in terms of OECD and other sources. We argue a little bit that we can clean it up better, but it doesn't seem to be the case that the results are depending on which kind of classification we follow. So what's interesting about this activity is that it's actually quite prevalent. There are a lot of companies that actually innovate. In our sample, we have over 11,000 companies with any kind of innovation activity, and over 5,000 of those companies actually have some kind of sort of green innovation, and almost 3,000 have some kind of brown efficiency innovation. So there is something to be said that this is not just a business of a few companies, but it's something that actually affects quite a lot of economic activity. And in the end, we are going to be looking at the data that is at the level of a firm and year. This is going to be the annual kind of frequency that we will be looking at in this particular discovery. So what is it that we will be looking at? Well, we are going to be measuring innovation with respect to the total amount of innovation that the firm produces. So in particular, we are going to look at the green ratios, which is how much of the green innovation you produce relative to your total, and the brown efficiency, which is a similar type of ratio. We also look at citations. We also look at the total amount of innovation. What I'm going to present to you today is largely based on these ratios. And also, what's important for today's talk, I'm going to be showing you the results strictly from the Euro Patent Office as a kind of indication that this is the office that has the kind of most stringent rules to accept something as innovation. So if you think that we are looking for the best kind of case for innovation, focusing on this specific type of innovation is going to give us the highest kind of chance to actually find something potentially useful. So what is it that we are going to be looking at here? Kind of three type of questions. The first one is directly related to, does the innovation activity predict future emissions at the firm level? And of course, we will want to recognize a little bit the time dimension. The decarbonization is not going to happen instantaneously, so we are going to look as much as possible into the future, up to 5 years. We had some experiments where we actually look at half of the period in which this innovation has happened. But today I'm just going to look mostly up to 5 years into the future. And then we will try to think a little bit about these mechanisms, the Jevons paradox, and the arrow learning by doing and replacement effects. So let me show you some numbers now, results that we have found in this data. So this is the first kind of set of results on the impact on decarbonization. And as I told you, this is kind of an empirical test of many channels that could potentially affect it. So there is, of course, the link that directly links innovation to R&D and technology, but there are also these indirect effects related to basically a rebound effect and some kind of displacement of technology elsewhere. So this is the set of results that show you how it is that innovation at the firm level affects its own emissions in the future. So in the data, we are going to be looking at all types of emissions, meaning scope 1, scope 2, upstream and downstream scope 3 emissions. And we are going to be distinguishing between measures of intensity, which are essentially emissions scaled by the revenue of the company, and the total emissions, which is what actually the social planner is thinking about as a global objective, because that's what directly gets into the climate effects. And what I want you to notice is there are two kind of sets of results. The top panel looks at innovation in the green space, so this is what we call the green patents. The bottom panel looks at these brown efficiency patents. So these are the patents that are supposed to just improve basically emissions, but not necessarily phase it out. And what you find from the top panel is a pretty stark, uniform result that there is very little evidence that average companies' innovation activity predicts subsequent reduction in emissions. Throughout all these regressions that you see, and we cut it by 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years into the future, you find that on average there is very little relationship between the quantity of innovation and the amount of emissions in the future. In turn, when you look at the bottom panel, which talks about the brown efficiency, you find some results which are even more perplexing, in a sense that you find that companies that actually produce more innovation in the brown efficiency space subsequently produce higher scope 1 emissions rather than lower. So there is a case to be made that there is actually some kind of rebound effect that is happening in this particular data, and I will show you a little bit on that in a moment. So then, of course, you can ask yourself this question differently and say, how large is this effect? How much can I use innovation as something that predicts decarbonization? So in other words, what's the economic significance of this innovation story? And one way to capture this is to look at the partial R-square of the regression that tries to explain actually future emissions. So just thinking about anything that can predict the future emissions at the firm level, we want to ask how much in terms of the variation of that number can be explained by the variation in innovation. And actually, interestingly, very little. Less than 1% of the total variation in the subsequent carbon levels of companies can be explained by the variation in innovation. So even if you think that there is actually a link from one to the other, it is actually economically a pretty small contributor to this particular quantity. So then, just in the remaining time, I wanted to walk you quickly through some of the mechanisms that we can look at because they are actually interesting. So the first story that comes to mind is that maybe what's happening is that companies kind of cruise on the predefined kind of path. That's the path dependency story of Aguillona, Cemoglu, and others, and we find evidence consistent with that. We find that typically companies that are older, they have accumulated a lot of particular technology, such as brown technology, they continue doing it into the future. And likewise, we find that companies that have accumulated a lot of green patents in the past are also continuing on this kind of green path going forward. So in some sense, if you worry about the kind of existing mix of the companies in the industry, and you worry about these companies which now contribute to the carbon problem, they don't seem to actually change their type. They stay on this predefined kind of path, which may explain why we don't observe too much of these decarbonization effects in the data. And we find it also on the intensive margin. In the interest of time, I skip it. What's actually also interesting is that this path dependency story that is typically related to the direct emissions also works at the indirect emission level. So here we have the unique opportunity to actually look at it from the perspective of scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And we find that companies, for example, which have also high scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, they continue using the brown technology. Those that have lower emissions, they continue using green technology. So there is a broader kind of path dependency than just the one about direct emissions. And then there is, of course, a story of Jevons paradox. I already highlighted it looking at the brown efficiency. So you can see a little bit of this in the context of sales of the companies. We find that essentially companies that are innovating in the brown space, they are increasing emissions, but largely because their sales go up, not because they actually are inefficient. If you look at the efficiency metrics of emissions, the intensities, they go down. It's just that rebound effect that creates this countervailing force that in aggregate actually creates more emissions rather than less emissions. So these companies are doing something good with technology. It's just that this demand factor kind of overshadows the supply of the technology factor. And then maybe let me skip that. The last thing I wanted to kind of show you in the last 2 minutes, if I may, is to tell you a little bit about the aggregate effects. Because of course, so far what I have presented is the effect at the firm level. You may argue that maybe what we need Tesla for is not so much for Tesla itself, but for everyone else who is going to use that technology. So there is a case to be made that these spillover effects are actually the real purpose of any kind of innovation that we observe in this world. And there are two ways to look at this. The first way to look at it is to look at the industry peers. So essentially thinking about the spillovers within the same industry kind of cluster and argue that companies that compete with each other are going to benefit from each other's kind of technological progress. And here you may distinguish between companies that do get involved in technology production and those that do not get involved in the technology production. And the upshot of all this analysis is that we actually find very weak evidence of improvements at the aggregate level as well. We don't find that companies that actually are in industries that innovate more subsequently reduce their emissions. If anything, we find that scope 2 emissions, which are related to the Tesla so-called story, are going up rather than going down. So that, again, creates this displacement effect in the way that more energy is being used and more carbon as a result is being produced. So we also look at this question from the perspective of other industries. We look at the story, what if actually technology transfers beyond the industry nexus? So you can look at this from the perspective of kind of granular versus non-granular industries. Just looking at SIT kind of 2-digit gigs industries versus 8-digit gigs industry numbers, you can see to what extent the technology kind of moves from one subcluster to another subcluster of that big industry group. And we find very similar effects, that even across these subclusters, there is very little evidence of the kind of average effect that would lead to a substantial decarbonization of these specific industries. So we also found as a last result that this is not really about innovation in the public versus private space. Even if you were looking at the innovation from the privately held companies, that innovation is not leading to an improvement of carbon footprint of the publicly listed companies. We don't have the data yet to look at the decarbonization in the private sector. That could be a question to kind of investigate in the future. So where does this bring me to? Well, what I want to argue today, and we kind of think collectively in this project, is that there is a lot of kind of sentiment behind this force of technological progress. There is a lot of capital that is being mobilized both from the governments and the private sector with the view that we all should be supporting the green innovation. This is not something we are actually saying is not right. What we want to caution in this project is the idea that this is not as simple as just channeling money to anyone who calls themselves a green or any kind of other innovator. That if you want to think about the meaningful kind of use of this capital in the process of decarbonization, these policies have to be a little bit more nuanced. That it cannot be just a simple transfer to anyone who basically holds the label a green innovator, and they are going to use that capital in the way that this is going to lead to decarbonization. So we are not trying to say don't innovate, we say support innovation that actually has a kind of tangible evidence in terms of decarbonization. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Time for one question? Yes, we have one.
How confident are you in the throughput data, especially for scope 2 and 3? Is there really meaningful terminal variation in that data?
No, that's always a challenge. I have two responses to that. The first response is always, can we do better than that at the level that we are operating, which is the global economy? And our evidence, at least from the research we've been doing with Patrick mostly, is it's very hard to find a better source. But maybe as a better kind of positive answer to the question, we have a number of different projects with Patrick where we took exactly the same data and related to other economic quantities such as values, returns, etc. In those experiments, the results are actually strong economically and statistically. So if you're worried about the pure measurement error and that attenuation bias, which is what I think you have in mind, you would expect that basically that should carry over to any experiment where you use the same kind of noisy data. So the fact that in some experiments this noisy data actually works tells you that maybe it's not as noisy as we think it is. But of course, we all are here to discuss what can we do to make the data better. We are not going to argue that the data is perfect. But we think that not doing anything is worse than trying to understand the channels that I think are important in this discussion. So as the kind of, between the two kind of worlds in how we would like to think about this problem, we think that doing something and isolating channels to the best possible ability is better than avoiding it for the reason of being skeptical about the data.